Welcome, everyone. Welcome. As you come in, if you would like to put your name and where you are zooming in from, that would be great. And we'll get started shortly. All right. Thank you for introducing yourself. Again, if you're just joining us, feel free to put your name in the chat box and where you're zooming in from. So good afternoon. My name is Alicia Wimbush. I am the Program Director of Religious Leaders at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. I would like to thank you for joining us for this afternoon's Lunch and Learn, where we will explore the topic of spiritual care to those who are grieving. We are living in a time of tremendous loss. We are acutely aware of the loss of lives in both Israel and Gaza, a loss of a sense of normalcy and security. And for some of us, we might even feel like we have lost community. We're not sure where to find solace or comfort during this time. As spiritual care providers, we have been tasked with the responsibility of helping people within and outside of our communities process these losses, both these global losses, but also just personal losses that we're all experiencing. And so we're helping people to navigate their grief and even creating spaces for people to grieve and feel comfortable enough to share what they're going through. We recognize that this is not easy work. And at the ICGS, we want to acknowledge the work that you all are doing. And so before we get started, I just invite you all to just to take a moment to pause. I can imagine you all have been running throughout this week and not always get in a space to just pause and breathe. And so I just want to give you space right now. We're just going to take a moment. I invite you to take in a few deep breaths and let us just acknowledge this moment that we are in together. And so let's just sit in silence, and then I will do introductions with our panelists. Thank you. So today I am so grateful to be joined by our four panelists. They're all spiritual care providers in various sectors. And I'm so grateful that in this moment that we are living in, we get to hear about their experiences working with people who are grieving. And so this is really a space for us to learn together. Even before we came on the call, we talked about we really want to create a space where we're sharing together, learning together. And so even you as an audience, you'll have time to ask questions. But if there's resources that you all have that you want to share in the chat box, we invite that as well. This is definitely a space where we are learning together. And so before we jump into our conversation, I just want to do some very brief introductions of each of our panelists. Their full bios are actually on our site, icgs.org. And so I'm just going to give you a snapshot of the work that they do. And in our Q&A time, if you have any other specific questions about their work or organizations, you can feel free to ask that at that time. But right now, we do ask if you would just remain on mute, and then we'll be collecting all your questions through the chat box. Our ICGS staff will collect those questions, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. But as we're having our conversation, we just ask that you remain on mute. So I am grateful today to have 4 people that I've gotten to know over some 15 years I've known, and some just over a course of a couple of months I have known them. But each of them bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to providing care, spiritual care to their communities. And so I'm glad that you all get to engage them in conversation. So first, I'm going to introduce Joella Darby. The Reverend Joella Darby serves as assistant to the pastor for discipleship of First Baptist Church, Capitol Hill in Tennessee, and she is also a PRN chaplain with Alive Hospice. And then we have Emily Kearns, who is currently the coordinator for Dementia-Friendly Baltimore County with the Baltimore County Department of Aging, providing community-wide dementia education, resources, and care partner support. So we are glad that she's here with us. And then we have Tala Drama, who works as a licensed psychotherapist and teaches at Towson University in Maryland as an adjunct professor in the psychology department. And so we are glad that he's here with us today. And then we have Zena Regis, who serves as the director of faith engagement, priority populations at Compassion and Choices, which is the nation's oldest, largest, and most active nonprofit working to improve care, expand options, and empower everyone to chart their end of life journey. And so welcome, all of you. Thank you so much for being here with us. And I'm excited for the conversation that we're going to have together and what we'll learn together. So we're going to get started. I actually want to start with you, Joella. I would love to hear from you. You kind of wear 2 hats as both an assistant pastor, but also working in hospice. And I would love to hear from you how grief shows up in your congregational work and also as your work as a hospice chaplain. And in what ways do these different contexts actually shape how you are helping people navigate their grief?
Good. Thank you. Thank you all for allowing me to be here. So in my role, I see grief showing up in both congregational work and in my work as a hospice chaplain. It shows up in lots of different ways. As a hospice chaplain, it shows up a little bit more freer, where I'm not their pastor. And so people tend to share a little bit more. They tend to let me in a little bit more and be willing to be a little bit more vulnerable about their grief and what's going on, because in hospice work, more than likely, it's all new news. And so it's all fresh and it's all raw. So they're more than likely to share and be a little bit more open. And in my congregational work, because I am in a congregation, people tend to feel the need to mask or to hide their grief because there's this fear that grief means that they lack faith. And so I see that a lot. And I may see it some in my hospice work, but definitely more in my congregational work. And so these different contexts, they shape how I desire to help people see grief, to see grief as natural and healthy, and it's needed. And it's my desire to help people enter into their grief journey, because especially if they have lost someone, if they're grieving due to death, then it changes them all the way. It changes them. And so they're never the same again. But to help them enter their grief journey and to embrace grief as a friend because of their faith. And it's an invitation to experience a deeper sense of intimacy with God. And for me, I like to help to correct some of the myths about grief and about God. And so, when I hear people say, God knows what's best, you can't question God. Well, it keeps people stuck. And so whether in hospice or whether in congregational care, being able to, debunk those myths and be able to help to reshape theology and give people freedom to express every range of emotion and the trust that God is present on the journey and that it's something that we can continue to work towards. So the ideal is for people to grieve well and to grieve forward. But yeah, so that's kind of some of the ways and that's kind of shape and help people to address it, to acknowledge it, and to, grief is going to be grief. And so, but we need to be free in that.
Thank you so much, Joella. And as I hear you speak about just these different contexts, how grief shows up, and even the work that you have to do, like in a congregational setting, giving people that space to grieve and say, Just because I have faith doesn't mean that, that I can't grieve. And so I appreciate just this sense of even helping people dispel some of the myths that they have around grief. So I love that. So want to go with you, Tala. You're in a different context. As a counselor, I know you've worked with African-American young males. And so I would love to hear from you. How does grief show up with them? And does religion play a role in how they're processing their grief?
Yeah, first of all, I'm honored to be here. I want to say peace and blessings be upon you all, and good afternoon. So, in my past working with Black male youth, grief, understanding grief shows up as so many colors. And when working with youth, they don't really have the language. And a lot of it was, from what I've observed, was very, it was behavioral. So people acted out their grief. And I remember this one incident where I had this client and he was getting into fights often. And we're in the car and I was asking him, like, or I was telling him, you got to stop getting into fights. There are other ways to address situations. And he was like, you don't know what it's like to lose a mother. Right. And I sat there and I didn't have anything to say. And that was also a reflection of how a lot of times we try to address grief. When we try to address grief, we look for this quick fix. I could have said something that was like, I don't know what it's like to lose a mother, but I'm sure your mother wouldn't want you to fight, right? But in that moment, I learned that grief, there isn't no quick fix to grief, and grief is something that you sit with, and you allow that person to name it. You allow that person to try to make sense of it, right? And there's a saying, you can't hear what you don't feel. So in that, I took that as a learning moment to sit with him and understand where he was coming from. Because grief comes up in so many colors, like I said before, sadness, anger, guilt. And for him, the way it was expressed was anger. And you don't realize these things until after. So.
Thank you so much. And I think you're right, especially with young people, they often aren't able to name their feelings or name, the situation that they're going through. But it is often through their behaviors that we can see what they're going through. And so I appreciate you just even sharing, just taking the time to say, like, wow, yes, you lost your mother. And this is the ways in which that grief was showing out, and to be able to create space for him. So thank you for that. Emily, you're also in a different sector, working with people both living with dementia and their loved ones. And I also know that you are doing work, end of life work as a death doula. Oftentimes we think about dementia and end of life, we just think about grief and sadness. But I would love for you to just lift up, how does both joy and grief show up in your work?
Yeah, thank you. And it's indeed an honor and a blessing to be here with all of you. So thank you for welcoming me. So I'm here primarily because both of my parents lived with and passed with dementia. And I refer to that journey as an awakening. It was certainly a crucible where I was crushed and opened. And so I bring to this conversation, but also to my day-to-day work, that lived experience and humility, and to continue to learn. But one of the things I'm seeing with caregivers, care partners, is that with the dementia journey, there's anticipatory loss. So there's a long journey of losing what has been, as we all head towards death and potentially next life. But what I also learned, and what I invite caregivers, care partners, and persons living with dementia to consider and to make space for, is indeed joy. And what I mean by that is something that I'm calling presencing. So we know it's cliche, just talk about this is the moment, seize the day, carpe diem. Yes. And I would say I would never welcome or invite dementia to visit someone's life. But if it is there, it is indeed an opportunity to live in the moment, to make space, as others have already said, for the grief, for the anticipatory grief of what's to come, for the true grief of what has been, but at the same time welcoming what is. And while there's no cure, the good news for all of us is that there's evidence-based and evidence-supported programs that enhance meaningful engagement, such as music and memory. So you can share music and movement and improv. And without being Disney or pretending that there's a magic wand, I truly believe that if we have the courage and the grace to show up for dementia, that we have an incredible opportunity to experience joy and to experience each one of us, the care partner and the person living with dementia, in a really new way. And the last thing I'll say is, in terms of joy, is that there's research showing that we continue to learn even on our deathbed. And even with dementia, and through touch and through music, as I mentioned, and through nature, there's a way of an awakening together to face our mortality, which our culture denies. We deny collectively the opportunity to make space for the grief of aging and preparing to pass from this life. But if we make the space, there truly is the potential, and I've seen it in my life and in others, and I've tried to help facilitate it, to experience humor and joy and healing. And, you know, I tell friends and family and clients, if you can show up, if you have any unleft business, and we all do, since we're all evolving, it's not about past business only, it's about what can we do now and who can we be now together? And that includes laughter. But again, not being Disney, making space for all of it. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emily. And I love that idea of presencing, with like the being present with people and really being in the moment. And sometimes what takes us away from really grieving is we don't want to be in the moment. We don't want to experience that. And so I love how you lift up that even in those moments of grief, there's those sparks of joy, there's laughter, humor. I know I've worked with persons living with dementia, and just singing, how much joy that brings. And, you know, oftentimes we're like, oh, well, they might not remember that. And you start singing and they're like, oh, they remember all the words. And so I appreciate just looking for those moments of joy, even in the sadness, even in the grief. But that means that we need to stay present. So thank you for that. Zena, I know also your work is about being present with people at the end of their life. And you're over the compassion and choices as a director of engagement. But I have found it interesting that even with the work that you do, you have found time to write a play. And your play is about, it's called Free Black Woman's Guide to Death and Dying. And so I would love for you to share with us how this play came about. And what role do you actually see the arts playing in helping individuals and communities both acknowledge and process their grief, but also acknowledge our own mortality? So I would love to hear, about your process and using art to acknowledge our grief.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alicia. And I'm so happy to be here with all of you. And both prior to my work with Compassion and Choices, I was a hospice chaplain for about a decade. And then in this work, but all throughout, the thread I've heard from people is people don't want to talk about death, dying, and grief. That is just not a conversation people are ready to have. But I found the opposite. Like when you give people a container that you've been intentional about creating, people do actually want to talk about it. And there are so many spaces where I will think the conversation is one thing, like I'm going to teach people how to do an advance directive. And then it becomes so much larger. And I get such a different response when I say, let's talk about an advance directive versus let's talk about what a good death looks like for you. And so allowing people to like talk about the story that they have around death and dying is just can be really a powerful teaching tool. And then people learn by overhearing. And so the play came about in that way, like how do I create a container for people to be able to talk about this in a way that's non-threatening and that feels safe and allows people to engage with their story. And And so through telling, the play is really a reimagining. Both my spouse and I have Aunt Cynthia's who died deaths that I don't think they would have chosen if they had had more choice and agency and control over their death. They both died in hospitals, not with their family. They just had these deaths that I just really wanted to reimagine because they were what I would say is the definition of free Black women who did what they wanted to do and had these really amazing and just experiences and lives and just were larger than life. And so I just wanted to reimagine what would it look like for them to die in a way that they would have chosen. And so, and I just think through the arts, like I've had so many people reach out to me after the play to be like, can we talk through this? Because I have questions. Even my mom, who I talk about this all the time, is like, I saw in the play, she did this. Let's talk about that. And so it just offers a teaching tool for us.
Thank you so much, Zena. And we need those different tools, or like you said, the different containers, because it's so interesting when we provide that container, what comes up. And so I think it's helpful as spiritual care providers for us to think about what are the tools in our toolkit. And so I believe art and creativity is one of those tools. So I have another question for you all before I get to like my last question before we open it up to the audience, but we do have some time. So I would love to hear from each of you. How has your faith, spirituality, religious upbringing, how has it actually helped you accompany people in their time of grief? And you can each take turns to answer that.
I can hop in. I feel like actually accompanying people in death and grief has changed my faith and my spirituality and my theology in so many powerful ways, just really expanded it, I would say. I think there is something about the great mystery that we are all facing that is just helped me to look at just my relationship with the divine differently and bigger. And so that is one of the things that I'm so grateful. But I think my faith has always allowed me to be present just because of the way that I just am so grateful for seeing God and light in the people that I am with. And really realizing at the end of the day, people just want to be seen and witnessed often. And so much of my presence has been less about, I think as like a baby seminary student, I thought I'd read all the books about like what dying people want, all these things. And I learned very quickly, like, there is just so much power in listening, being a non-anxious presence, as we all talk about as chaplains, but also in giving people permission to really see the holiness and the sacredness of their experience. And just giving them permission to be completely present. One of the things that really became a tool in my toolbox as a hospice chaplain was allowing people to say, you can put your phones away, because right at a death or right on the deathbed, our impulse is distraction. Like, I want to distract myself from this. So giving people just the permission to say, let's just take a moment and create a ritual for this time and really mark the holiness of this. Or as people are dying, we're in a really holy and sacred space. How do we want to mark this has been really one of my biggest gifts in learning that as a chaplain.
Thank you, Zena. Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, thank you. So I was raised Catholic, but I would say that informed it in a very different way. And more currently, Buddhist teachings and Reiki have helped me witness folks along their journey with dementia. The Buddhist tradition talks about impermanence and suffering as a part of life, not trying to constrain it or fix it, and being mindful of it and showing up for it. And that's such an invitation. But and through my Catholic upbringing, ritual played a major role. And actually, Zena, you just mentioned it. And I find the ritual not only of Christianity, but the rituals we can create, including Reiki, gathering with people, light touch, touch is so important, allows a space for the collective body to support the individual and families. And the other thing that I would say is that all religions talk about compassion, and the great prophets and teachers and texts talk about, compassion for all without judgment. And I think that has brought me beyond religions with a big R, beyond any single religion, and to really, empathize with individuals and families and communities that are grieving and that deserve witnessing and support. In showing up, all of us showing up together. So that's how the spirituality, how I bring spirituality, I guess, to my day to day. And my work I see as a calling, actually, and a vocation, not as a job. And that really reframes how I pick up a call or write an email. And sometimes my family will say, well, how about boundaries? I'm like, this is about love. And I don't mean it in a cliche way. This is people living 10, 15 years as a caring relationship with dementia and really needing support on a whole being, a whole person level. And that's the final thing I'll say is it's just not psychology and it's just not the physical. I would say the spiritual is as equal to me, maybe even more primary through the entire journey. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Emily. Tyler, did you want to go next? I saw you unmute.
Yeah,
Then Joe.
I was gonna say, I was gonna comment on Zena's her statement when she was saying how she was a baby seminary. I'm a baby seminary. I'm in seminary school now, and what I'm learning is the difference between supporting versus comforting. They're both equal, and there's no wrong or right or bad way. But I think comforting sometimes we don't do it intentionally, but it becomes invalidating, right? So we start quoting scripture, spiritual bypassing, but you can still use religion in supporting. So, for example, when we look at the prophetic tradition, Islam, Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, he was given to us as an excellent example. And just because of his humanity. And when he spoke to people, he turned his whole body around. He was an active listener. So embodying the qualities that the prophet had, we can do as well when dealing with grief. And as I'm in seminary school, I see a lot of people using scripture or whatnot when we're doing our theological reflections, but having the simple tools as active listening, presence, as someone mentioned, these are all prophetic and religious tools as well. And looking at the prophet in his life, the prophet lost his father after his birth. He lost his mother at the age of 6. He lost his grandfather at the age of 8. Then he was raised by his paternal uncle. His paternal uncle and his first wife of 25 years died in the same year. They called that the year of sorrow. He lost 6 out of his 7 children. So we use this model and we can relate it to our own experiences, right? Not by just comforting people with scripture, but being able to apply it in our own lives, right? And helping people apply it in theirs and finding meaning in that way, right? And understanding the purpose of what God has for all of us. So that when I think about using religion, I think about that.
Thank you, Tala. Joella, would you like to share?
Yes. I was thinking about what Emily was sharing, just in terms of, growing up Catholic, but leaning or being able to use some of Buddhist theology. I think about how I grew up. So I grew up as a pastor's kid, Fire Brimstone Baptist Church, right? And so, I grew up knowing about God, but not knowing God. And so when I was in college, kind of taking this journey of owning my own faith, and as I began to own my faith and even going through seminary and just learning and just being present with people, then I began to adopt this model of God, or this image of God, as companion. And so that has really helped to shape me and how I accompany people in their grief, is that I want to companion with people on their journey, not my journey for them, but their journey. The journey that I want for them is for them to grieve well. But there's not this destination of health or healing or wholeness on the other side of loss, but there's this journey that we all go through, as I said, because, death changes us. We're not the same anymore after we lose someone. And I remember the first time I was able to get out of my own box as it relates to religion and faith, when I met a woman who was Wiccan. And I was like, I have no idea what it means to be Wiccan. So, of course, I grew up, anything that wasn't Christian was bad, And so even how my faith began to teach me that God is bigger than what I was taught, bigger than any religion. Like, God surpasses all of that. God is bigger. And so being able to ask the question of myself, what does she need that I can help provide for her? It's not what I, as a Christian, think she needs, but what does she need? And so, and I just said, hey, I'm sorry, I'm just really ignorant. I don't know a lot about Wiccan faith, but can you please tell me so I can kind of better serve you? And so as she began to share, and I began to say, okay, she uses the language of an altar. I know what an altar means. And so I was able to connect with her, and we talked about her creating an altar so that she can grieve well. And so for me, just myself being on my own journey of faith and realizing that for me, embracing the image of God as companion, that I companion with people. Whatever they need, I join them. I learn from them and I learn with them as I serve them. And so it's not just me, the Christian, with all the right answers, but it's me, the chaplain, me, the minister, being able to come and say, what do you need and how can I help? So I do have something to provide. I just want to make sure I'm providing the right thing that's bringing wholeness to you and not hurting you on your journey. And so just being able to realize it's their journey, not my journey. And so that's one of the things that's kind of helped me to accompany people, is to reassure them that everything is allowed, and that everything is for their benefit to help them grieve well.
Oh, that is beautiful. Thank you all just for sharing your journeys. And it's interesting, as I was listening to you, how you all were open to evolution and changing your thought processes. And it's interesting when we are meeting with people from a lot of different backgrounds, how we open up ourselves and our vision of the divine, the transcendent also changes. And we recognize, some of the things that we've learned in seminary or in Sunday school might not work in this setting. But how can we be open to the person that is in front of us? And so thank you just for sharing your journeys. We have some amazing questions from the audience. And so before we get to them, I just wanted to share, we are all just acutely aware of what's going on in our world. I also just think about that we have lived through a pandemic. We're still experiencing that. We're seeing wars. We're seeing what's happening in Israel and Gaza. And we've kind of talked about individually how we are providing care for people. I would love for you all to just share, what does communal and collective grieving look like? I feel like with all that we have gone through as a world, as global citizens, I don't know if there's always enough spaces for us to do some collective grieving. And so I would love if you all would share, what are some lamenting practices that you have done in community that could be based upon your own spiritual practices or understanding, or just something that you have seen out in the world. So yeah, let's talk about what are some spaces for collective grief, particularly in the times that we're living in. Go ahead, Emily.
Hi, thank you for that question. So I come to this through a trauma and grief lens, seeing that, and also want to give a reference of a book, seeing that, most of us respond to trauma and grief as mammals do out in the wild, which is we fight, we flee, you know, or we freeze. And we do that individually, but also collectively. And so what I'm seeing is that unless we have safe, as was spoken about, a safe container for rituals of grief, then the fight, flight, and freeze actually come out collectively in really potentially violent ways. Violence turned inward, individually, but also in family systems and also collectively. And so what I'm seeing is the potential to create containers for nonviolent acknowledgement of grief and practices. One of the ways I'm seeing it, and we don't often think of it this way, is nonviolent protest and vigils, where people gather together. I think these are really important to reframe or to think about as ritual, where our voices can be heard, and so I've gathered for other issues, and I'm seeking community now to do, with candles in candlelit vigils where people give testimony about their loss and their rage, so that fight, flight, and freeze can be held safely in this container, in this vigil. I also see it currently in prayer spaces, especially in the Jewish and the Muslim communities. And that's so important. People are gathering and trying to create their safe spaces. I think for me, I'm seeking more of these spaces for non-violent ways to express our grief and our stance, and to make sure it's safe. And I think it's very hard to do. I think our crime and also certainly wars, for me, through that lens, are grief spaces, grief that has not been healed, and intergenerationally. And the rage and the grief is coming out. And so that allows me to be more compassionate, but also to seek how can we bring an end to war, but without denying the grief of the victims, and also certainly not perpetuating further trauma and grief upon this and future generations. So it's not an easy wand. I wish I had like a whole inventory of sites. But to me, I'm seeking that, and I'm also interested in helping folks create it. So thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Joella?
Yeah, I was going to say, just, from my context, in addition to the visuals and the gatherings, is while gathering is to write liturgies of lament. And so it's very important. So one of the things that we try to do is okay, lamenting is a biblical thing. It's not something that's new. And just leading them through, in my context within the congregation, leading them through scripture of lament and writing them in their own words, so that they become one with their words, and that they're being authentic and honest in that. And so I would just say definitely writing liturgies of lament and sharing it together in community, lamenting together, crying together, and providing the safe space or not even just a safe space, the brave space for us to be courageous enough to grieve and to do it together.
Thank you so much, Joella. Tala or Zena, did you want to share?
Sure, I'll pop in. I think one of the most powerful things we can do is think about our spaces and what people might need. And I think so often when we talk about grief, people think they need to have all the answers, but often we just need a space. And so one of the things that last year, the college, I went to Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia. And the alumni office reached out and said, we've had so many alum who have lost spouses. So would you do a grief, like just a grief reading where people can bring poetry or something and talk about it? And they imagined that it would be a small group of older alum. It was one of the highest attended events that the alumni office had. And it was great diversity from people who graduated last year to people who graduated in the 50s. And it was such a powerful intergenerational environment. And it was just them noticing like this is coming up, and people had so many stories, and we ended up meeting a series of times through the holidays. And I just say that to say that like so many spaces just need someone to hear and to bear witness. And so you don't have to have all of the answers. You don't have to have, the background in grief, but just saying, let's get together and read poems and see what stands out for you and how that resonates with your grief journey. I also have this book. It's called Hello, Goodbye, and it's by Day Shilkret. And it's about 75 rituals for times of loss, celebration, and change. And so he has written what he calls a cookbook of rituals, where people can get together and just do a ritual to mark whatever's happening in their life. And I just find things like that really beautiful. And there's another book, Send My Roots Rain by Kim Langley. That's a poetry companion for grief. And so often when I'm asked to talk about grief, I'll bring some of these resources and just kind of put it out as a menu for people to gather for what resonates with them. And so I think anytime that we can get together and talk on this on a human to human level is really powerful. Like I have to remind myself all the time that people don't talk to each other the way we talk to each other online. Like I can be on social media and feel like, oh my goodness, everybody hates each other. There's no real conversation going. Like no one has any nuance. But the moment humans get together, even online or like in person, it's a completely different feel. And so those are just the things that come up for me when thinking about that.
Thank you, Zena, and thank you for those resources. I wrote them down. Give me the name of the Kim Langley book again.
Oop. I'll put them in the chat, but they're
okay. Perfect.
Yeah, I can put them in the chat.
Okay, thank you. And then Tala, if you want to share, and then we will get to our questions from the audience.
Yeah, just echoing Zena. I think we don't have the solutions or the answers we're always yearning for, but just be able to provide space for people. Like it doesn't matter if it's a large group of people or if it's just 3 people. I just know holding that space for each other and just sharing that the feelings that people may be having. So sharing the tears of people. I know tears are mercy. So sharing the tears, sharing their experience, because sometimes it is a collective experience to also to know that you're not alone. Because a lot of times with grief, we isolate ourselves, right? People don't want to burden other people with what they may be going through. So being able to just, whether it was picking up the phone or grabbing coffee or just going to sit at somebody's house. I was watching a show yesterday. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Shy. It was I think it's like on Paramount. But he went to his cousin's house and his cousin kept talking and talking. He was like, "Hey, do you mind if we could just sit here in silence for a second?" So that space, knowing someone is there just to share that with you. So,
oh, thank you, Tala. And sometimes we don't realize that it is just that simple, like just sitting in silence with each other. So thank you. Thank you. So and with the next about 10, 15 minutes, we have some wonderful questions here. And not all the panelists have to answer all the questions unless they're specifically directed to you. But if you want to jump in, feel free to do so. So the first question we have here is, what have you learned from accompanying non-religious people in their death and grief journey? And again, that's what have you learned from accompanying non-religious people in their death and grief journey?
I'll hop in because one of my Compassion Choices, one of our great supporters is Black non-believers and women of color beyond belief. And so there are 2 atheist and agnostic groups. And so I actually just did a panel not too long ago for the group. And what I've learned is that we don't have like story-centered end-of-life planning, story-centered grief sharing, like it's centered on the story. And like, we don't have to have it centered on our deity. That may be part of our story, but just giving people the space to talk about what their story looks like is really powerful. And so I'll have like some of my colleagues be like, I don't know how to talk about death and dying with atheists and agnostics. And I'm like, you do. Like, you totally do. It's just about centering on the person's story. Even like to the point, we talk a lot about memorial services in that group. And like, they're like, it's really difficult for someone to respect their non-belief in a memorial service. And some of the consultation that I've given people who are doing them is like, focus on the story of the person. Honestly, even religious people could do much better at focusing on the story of the person who has died. And so thinking about it in those terms has been really helpful for me.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Tala.
Yeah, I was going to say what I've learned is everyone, despite being religious or not, believes in something. So connecting that for them to that something, right? And then finding purpose and meaning in it. A lot of times with grief, there's this loss of connection. So now we're trying to reconnect to the person, to what it is that they believe in.
Thank you for that. And I love, I often think of what brings people meaning. And so what is it? Nature? Is it your family? What are the values that shape your life? So connecting people back to that. Thank you. Emily or Joelle, again, you don't have to. We have lots of great questions, but if you want to jump in, you can.
Yeah, I'll just say that, I do dementia practice and training. And one of the things that we emphasize is stepping into someone else's reality and I really believe that strongly. I say this is beyond dementia. This is just like for day-to-day living, although in the dementia context. So if someone says it's morning, you say it's in a beautiful morning, isn't it? And someone said, well, that's lying. And I'm like, actually, no. And so I think that's one of the things that I'm learning and still practicing is whatever someone else's narrative is, not necessarily to agree with it, but to show up with it, to show up to it. To me, presencing is, and I think it was Joella said, to be a companion, to be a witness, and not to lose our own story or whatever, but to be in the theater, on the stage. And that's the analogy I use for someone. I said, imagine that if you can't do it for certain reasons, if it's hard for you, imagine suddenly you're in a play and you are speaking with someone else, entering their reality. So that's helped me greatly when people are journeying and also, through dementia and also at the end of their life. I say to people, it's not about me anymore, as an adult child. And that's really hard to check my ego at the door and say, now it's about companioning with the other person. And that's a whole reframe from our culture, our cultural practice. Thank you.
Thank you.
I disagree with everything's been said. That was good.
Well, Joella, I have a specific question for you, actually.
Okay.
Somebody asked, thank you for naming how people often want to hide their grief because they think that it means that they don't have faith. Can you explain more about how you help reshape theology so that people see grief in light of their faith? And how do you do that with someone of a different religious background than you? Do I need to repeat that? Yes, I know it's a lot. Yes. So explain how do you help people reshape theology so that they can see grief in light of their own faith? And how do you do that with someone of a different religious background than you? And you kind of shared some of that when you talked about the patient who was Wiccan. So just kind of unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. I think the first way I begin is giving people permission to express their feelings and say, it's okay. And sometimes I'll even say, it takes more faith to be honest with God than it is to be dishonest. So let's look at faith differently. And so a lot of times we look at faith as I have to be strong. I have to be this. I have to be this. It's like, really? That's not faith. Don't get me wrong. I think that's part of faith, but that's not all of faith. And so strength is being able to be vulnerable. And to be able to say, like, this does not feel good. I'm sad. I'm hurt because in your honesty, you're trusting that God is not going to leave you. And so if you're hiding, it's because you're afraid. So let's talk about, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid that if you're honest and somehow you're not going to be a mature Christian, you're not going to be as saved, as holy as you want people to believe? And so all of those things are hindering your growth and your ability to really enter into a deeper connection with God. And so, because if you're able to be honest, then you're able to get your needs met. Closed mouth don't get fed. And so, yeah. So if you want comfort, you need to be able to say, I'm feeling the need to be comforted, or I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm feeling distraught, or I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling this. Even if you look at the Beatitudes, you'll get it. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And so there's a gift when we're able to be honest. So a lot of that is giving people permission and trying to redefine faith and redefine strength, and redefine what they think it means to be a mature believer. And so even with the whole quoting of scriptures and all of that, I may quote one or two, but really not. And so I've learned that it's not helpful. And so I think that because I feel like it's quickly, you can easily or quickly run to that. And that's another way of hiding. Versus I'll tell them, I said, well, let's look at some of the Psalms, because they were honest. They were very honest in their feelings. They may tack on, okay, but God, I trust you. But the first part is, okay, it says, God, I'm angry, I'm hurt, I'm mad. Like, I trust that you will get me through this, but right now, this is how I feel. And I think that there's a sense of freedom. And it helps us to really deepen our faith. And so I really try to help them deepen their faith in that way, and to say, this helps you to grow deeper in your walk with God. And so, because a lot of people they turn away from God because they don't feel that freedom to express that. So I try to help redefine faith and redefine strength, and redefine all of what we think it means to be mature believer in that. And then somebody who is non-religious. Yeah, I talked about that earlier. I try to, and I think Emily said this earlier, keep my ego in check. And that was beautiful for me to say, I really do not have to feel like I have to have the answers. Like, that's not my role in their life. My role, and I can say I'm not their pastor, but even as their pastor, if I was their pastor, I'm still not their God. And so for me to be able to say my role is to create space. It's to give you space to feel, to talk. And there's times when I've told people, I'm just like, you know what? I will sympathy cry with you. And so there's like, what? I said, yeah, if you start talking, I'll cry with you. And so I don't have words, because it's your journey. And when my dad died suddenly 5 years ago, I saw a shift in really how I began to deal with death. So I try to give people what I needed that I didn't get. Because people thought that they needed to encourage and all this sort of stuff. And, when I felt like I really wanted to go off on somebody in a prayer call, who said something, trying to be helpful, I guess, well, God can't be questioned. You can't get mad at God. I'm like, who else I'm gonna get mad at? I can't get mad at you, and so to be able to say, that's not what I needed, was freedom. To take off my reverend hat and grieve the fact that my daddy has just died, and it's traumatic. And I can't think, I can't process, I can't figure stuff out, because I need to grieve. So I just kind of shut everybody out. He gave me all the religious answers. And I said, I can't deal with that, because it's not helping me. And so, yeah, so I try to give people what I needed, and what I provided for myself and what I sought out, whether it's therapy, grief share, different things. Like, I sought out resources to be able to say, what happens when the preacher's hurting? The preacher hurts. And the preacher is okay with hurting. And so, yeah, so that's what I just try to give everybody. It's just space to just be real, to be authentic. Because I believe that's when we really mature, when we're able to be brave and vulnerable. So that's my spiel.
Yes, thank you so much, Joelle. And you actually you touched on one of the questions from the audience about how do you share your own experiences of grief when appropriate. And you kind of are highlighting that, like, when you experienced the death of your father, like, what did you need in that moment, and to be able to take that into a caring relationship moving forward. Anybody else, like, how do you use your own experiences of grief? Because we've all been touched in different ways. How does it shape how you're accompanying people? Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, I always tell people why I'm there. And like if it's a public presentation, for example, at a faith community, whatever, I say I'm here because of the awakening, because of what happened in my family. And I don't carry on about it. And I also say one journey is one journey. So this is mine. But I have found, as long as I don't say I know how you feel, I don't say that. But I have found that it helps with that container that folks, when I say, I've never been a spouse of someone who's passed with dementia, I've been an adult daughter, but you're not alone. We're here with you. I felt people get that for the most part, and they welcome the presence, and a presence that like has a lived experience, even though I always, like I said, I always qualify it, never pretending to really know their experience, but to have had a lived experience of grief, specifically in dementia. It seems to, I don't want to say the word comfort, no, but seems to, contain, help shore up that container. And it makes me vulnerable, and perversely, the vulnerability is a strength. It's a moment of grace, I think, when we can all be vulnerable together. And so to share that vulnerability helps with that strengthening of the container.
Thank you, Emily. So we have so many wonderful questions, and I'm so sorry we can't get to all of them. Hopefully our panelists did see some of them in the chat, and you can reach out if there were some specific ones addressed to you. But I always just like to take time just to acknowledge and thank our panelists for their experience and their wisdom. So those in the audience, just share your appreciations with our panelists in the chat box. And I hope that you all did learn something from them, that we learned something together. And so in the last 4 minutes, I just want to say, if you all have enjoyed this conversation and you are interested in hearing more about the programming that we provide spiritual care providers, please visit us at our website at icjs.org, and you can actually donate there. ICJS is a non-sectarian and independent, unaffiliated with any academic or religious organization. And so we are supported by people like you. So while we strive to make all our programming available at no cost, we ask for your support in making our work possible. And please subscribe to our emailing list. We have an email list specifically for spiritual care providers. So if you're interested in receiving updates about our next lunch and learns, we have upcoming events at ICGS. Please subscribe so that you can get that information. And I am so excited. We have been doing a series, our Mannequin Clark series. We had Dr. Walter Fluker, who was our lecturer, and he lifted up the work of Howard Thurman, who we know was a theologian, a mystic, and also a spiritual care provider, and somebody that really shaped my walk as a chaplain and understanding of chaplaincy and what it means to really be there for people. But we actually have a public study group on Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited. Our first one was actually yesterday, but we have 2 more. If you're in the Maryland area, Baltimore area, because these are in person, we have a session November 8th and November 15th. So if you are interested in that in-person experience, studying Jesus and the Disinherited, please join us. And we actually have our Mannequin Clark lecture on YouTube. So if you want to hear from Dr. Walter Fluker, as he talks about the legacy of Howard Thurman, please check out our YouTube channel. And then I also wanted to share another opportunity for spiritual care providers. We at ICGS, we provide space for spiritual care providers to come together and really deepen their own spirituality, learn about the religion and faith of other spiritual care providers. And so in the beginning of 2024, we will be offering interreligious spiritual spirituality groups. And so we will drop a link in the chat box if you're interested in joining a spirituality group. I know that there's a lot of different community of practices out there through ACPE and other different organizations, but ICGS is offering this to spiritual care providers. And we meet throughout the year. And so if that's something you're interested in, we would love to have you. So we'll put that information in the chat box. So again, panelists, thank you so much for being with us. This was so enriching, and I appreciate you all just taking the time to just be in conversation with this community. And I look forward to other spaces and other times that we can meet together. And for those who joined us today, I look forward for you being with us in some other events and sessions that we will have here at ICGS. And so before you jump off, there will be a survey that will populate. So I ask that you would just take 2 or 3 minutes just to fill that out so that we can get your feedback and so that we make sure that our programming is meeting your needs. So again, thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.